So Esther, Pippa, and I, and indeed very many other people, are working on the writing systems of the Bronze Age Aegean, so essentially Greece, and in particular with a particular focus on the island of Crete, and of the Eastern Mediterranean, with a particular emphasis on the island of Cyprus. So these two places, Crete and Cyprus, will play the main role in our discussion. So what are we talking about? Yeah, right. So in Greece itself, we have three main writing systems that I'm going to mention first, and there are a few smaller ones which we'll come to in due course. As I'm sure you know, these are Cretan hieroglyphic, linear A, and linear B. Now, of these three, the Cretan hieroglyphic is the oldest, then comes linear A, and at the end comes linear B. You can see some rough dates here, 1900 to about 1700 for Cretan hieroglyphic, 1800 to about 1450 for linear A, and 1400 to 1190 for linear B. Now, these writing systems are often called logosyllabaries because they denote either words, meaning that one sign stands for a word, or more commonly, that a sign stands for a syllable, and to be more precise, an open syllable, meaning a syllable ending in a vowel. Now, this is quite clear for linear A and linear B. It is not so very clear for Cretan hieroglyphic, because Cretan hieroglyphic is, of these three, easily the script that we understand the least well. That is also true when it comes to the language. It is clear that linear B is used, and indeed exclusively used, to write Greek, a very early form of Greek, Mycenaean Greek. Linear A is used probably to write one language that we might as well call Minoan, although it has also been argued that linear A actually denotes several different languages that were spoken on the island of Crete. And Cretan hieroglyphic, I'm afraid we simply do not know. So if we could have the next slide, perhaps. Thank you very much. Yeah. Zooming in onto on the island of Crete, you can see here the most important find spots for the evidence for these three writing systems. In blue, we have linear A, which, as you can see, is found all over the island, from Chania in the west to Zakros and Palikastro in the east. In red or purple, we have Cretan hieroglyphic, and in yellow, we have linear B, which, as you can see, is found only on the north coast, in Chania and in Knossos. Cretan hieroglyphic also only found in the north of Crete, but essentially further to the east, Knossos, Malia, and Petras. Right, next slide, please. Yeah, so that's what we're talking about. When are we talking about? Now, the earliest of these scripts is Cretan hieroglyphic, as I said, which is attested from 1900 onwards, 1900 BC onward, but dies out at about 1700, or maybe slightly later. At around 1700, many of the palaces were destroyed, very probably by an earthquake, and Cretan hieroglyphic does not seem to have survived that destruction, or maybe it has done so, but just barely. Okay? Now, linear A was much more successful. It arises a bit later than Cretan hieroglyphic, but not much later, maybe sometime between 50 and 100 years later, from 1800 onwards. And it does survive the destruction of the palaces around 1700. In fact, goes down all the way to about 1450, when we have yet another destruction that we should talk about. Okay. Linear B essentially sets in when linear A peters out at about 1400 and then survives until about 1200 BC when, again, we are talking a violent destruction of palaces, not just on Crete, but also on the Greek mainland. The chronology on Cyprus is slightly different. Here, we're talking two writing systems. First of all, Cypro-Minoan, and then Cypro-syllabic. Cypro-Minoan is attested from about 1600 to 1050 BC onwards, and it then morphs into Cypro-syllabic. How exactly that happens, well, maybe we can talk about that later on. It's not entirely clear. Often the word orthography reform is used here. But essentially, Cypro-syllabic sets in when Cypro-Minoan peters out. And Cypro-syllabic is then used for a very long period of time, for 700 or 800 years. And it is used to write essentially the Cypriot form of Greek, but also another language that we can call, or that is commonly called Ethio-Cypriot. Right, next slide, please. Yeah, so here we see a relative chronology that the archaeologists have established. This orientation, Cretan hieroglyphic is essentially the script that is closely associated with the first palaces. So in other words, with the proto-palatial period. And as soon as that proto-palatial period comes to an end at around 1700, okay, so does Cretan hieroglyphic. Linear A sets in slightly later, okay, in Middle Minoan 2, and then carries on. Much of the evidence for Linear A comes from later Middle Minoan 2 and indeed from Middle Minoan 3. That's probably the bulk of the evidence. So it seamlessly seems to survive from the proto-palatial into the neo-palatial period. And Linear A is associated with, as it were, the heydays of Minoan culture. All these beautiful artifacts that I'm sure you have seen are closely aligned with the early neo-palatial period. Survive into late Minoan, but after late Minoan 1, it disappears. And in late Minoan 2 or 3A, Linear B takes over. Right, yeah. The next slide, please. So we've seen the chronology, Middle Minoan 2 to 3. And I've also said that Cretan hieroglyphic is attested really in on the north coast of Crete. Knossos, Malia, Petras are by far the most important find spots for this. Now, the number of document types is fairly limited. We have, first of all, seal stones. They carry sculpted intaglio inscriptions, like the one on the bottom right that you can see, rather beautifully carved. We have about 130 of those. We also have clay documents carrying impressions of these seal stones, from which we can then deduce what the seal stone must have looked like, about 50 or 55 of those. And then we have here on the right-hand side, incised clay documents, and they come in a variety of shapes. So we have got tablets like the one on the right, but these are actually quite rare. And then we have crescents like the one on top, and roundels or medallions like this one with the hole at the bottom. So what all of these documents have in common is that they are certainly all, or very likely, administrative documents, and that is something that sets Cretan hieroglyphic apart from Linear A. If we could have the next slide, please, we should see that. Yeah. Linear A is geographically much more widespread than Cretan hieroglyphic, as we've seen. It's in use for much longer. It is also found outside Crete, but only a few scattered remains. It is really very highly concentrated on the island of Crete still. And just as we've just seen with the Cretan hieroglyphic, we find administrative documents like these clay documents on the left. So a tablet here from Aya to the other, and then also smaller documents like these two roundels. Okay? So these was just little lumps of clay inscribed that were attached to commodities or associated with delivery of commodities. But importantly, linear A was used much more widely. On the right, you can see some further objects. So, for example, a cup, okay, where we've got an inked linear A inscription on the inside. Next to that, a sort of a scoop or a ladle. You can't see the inscription very well. And then in the middle, a very beautiful gold ring that comes from out of Spatial near Knossos. And you can probably see the linear A inscription going in a spiral from the rim down to the center. Then bottom left, a so-called libation table, a religious object, a bit like an altar, and these libation tables on the rim very often carry linear A inscriptions. And then on the right, finally, a silver hairpin. So again, within a linear A inscription, which is hard to see. And of course, these are very small, as it's a hairpin. So you can imagine just how intricately well written and incised these documents are. So the geographical, the spatial use of linear is much wider than that of Cretan hieroglyphic, but also the actual range of uses as you can see. When we go down to linear B, next slide, please. It all contracts a bit again. Okay? As far as chronology is concerned, I'd say it starts about 1400. But geographically, it is not confined at all to Crete. We find linear B as the only of these three scripts on the Greek mainland as well. The main find spots here encircled in blue: Pylos, Mycenae, and Thebes. But now also, excitingly, Agios Vasilios on the Peloponnese, which you can see there, which to all intents and purposes seems to be the Bronze Age Sparta, on which over the last 10 years has thrown up a good number of linear B tablets, well into three-digit numbers here. Now, linear B, just like Cretan hieroglyphic, seems to have an exclusive or almost exclusive administrative use. Okay, so we've got clay documents, tabs and ceilings above all. Okay, the only exception, or the only exception, really are painted vases like the one on the bottom right, but these are not particularly numerous. If we could have the next slide, please. Yeah, moving further east, Cyprus. Okay. So if you just look at these documents, really look very, very different. From about 1600 onwards, they're found mainly in Cyprus, but also on the coast of the Levant in Ugarit, with which Cyprus had close economic ties. Most of the documents are again big clay documents, tablets like the ones here, or clay balls. Okay, but we find Cyprian inscriptions also on vases, ivory, metal, and indeed stone objects. So again, the use of Cyprian seems to have been a lot wider than that of Cretan hieroglyphic and of linear B. Okay, next slide, please. Out of Cyprian develops Cypro-Syllabic, which is then in use from the 11th to the 3rd century and found on Cyprus only. We find clay tablets like the one on the bottom left, We also find bilingual inscriptions, like the one in the middle, which is a Phoenician Cypriot bilingual. And on the right, you see the longest extant Cypriot inscription, the so-called Idalian bronze. So a good number of surfaces and a variety of uses. If you could have the next slide, then I can say something about the other scripts. The earliest script that we need to talk about, however, is one of the smaller ones. That's the so-called Arcanis script, found on a group of seals from the cemetery of Phoni near Arcanis, not very far from Knossos at all. Now, this is a group of about 15 seals. They all bear the same inscription. And if we use the sound values that we have in linear A, then the formula that we find on all of these seals might read Asa Sarame or Asa Sarane. This has recently been doubted, and indeed with good reason. And this Arcana script is in many ways still highly enigmatic. And is also, as you can see, extremely repetitive. So we only have evidence for 4 different signs in this script, which makes deciding the question in what way it is related to the other Cretan scripts very difficult to answer. Could I have the next slide then, please? Yes, it would not be complete without looking at the Festos disc, a clay disc, about 15 centimeters in diameter, from Festos, southern coast, southern Crete, often dated to the early 17th century, but in fact the dating is contentious, and it is not clear because it wasn't found in reliable context. What sets this document apart from all the rest is that the signs are stamped. Okay? So the signs are impressed. So with little seals or something of the sort, and the shape of these characters looks pretty unique, or at least it looked pretty unique until, next slide please, in 1934, in the cave of Arpelohori, a bronze axe was found. And as you can see in the middle of the axe, there are a number of signs that most of which look quite similar to those on the Festos disc. So there may well be a relationship between these two. Again, this document is loosely dated to between 17 and 1600, but as it's the only one of its kind, and the inscription is very short. Next slide, please. Right. So, what are the relations between these scripts? Now, the exact relationship between Cretan hieroglyphic and linear A is not clear. It is entirely possible that linear A did develop out of Cretan hieroglyphic, but there are question marks here. Linear A clearly gave rise to linear B, which follows linear A immediately. But linear A also clearly gave rise to Cypramanon. And as I've already said, Cypramanon then, the end of the second millennium, morphed into Cypro-syllabic. So all of these syllabaries eventually die out on Crete. They die out at around 1200. On Cyprus, much more stable, and the Cypro-syllabic script is used for another 900 years or so. It is used. It is the only writing system used in order to denote the Cypriot dialect of Greek, but also a genuine or an isolated language found in Cyprus called Cypriot. The alphabet takes the place of the writing systems on Crete fairly early on, from about the 7th century onwards, right? Whereas on the island of Cyprus, it takes all much later. Okay, and if you could, the languages: Cretan hieroglyphic, uncertain; linear A, Manon; Cypramanon, again, we don't really know much about. Linear B is Greek Cypro-syllabic, denotes Greek, but also Ethio-Cretan, as I've already said. And the next slide, please. Right. Yeah. Now, just a few words about what we're actually doing in Cambridge. There are a couple of projects going on that deal with the digitization of all of this evidence. For Linear A, we have Sigla, the Science of Linear A paleographical database, which Esther will talk about a bit later on. And we also have Calibra, that we've had for a good number of years now, the Cambridge Linear B Research Archive, which currently contains a database of photographs of Linear B inscriptions from Pylos, but we have grand plans, and we hope to enhance this with RTI images of Linear B inscriptions from other parts of Greece as well, and hopefully some Linear A inscriptions as well. Okay, and the final slide for this, yeah, because this is where we are now. For the time being, we have the printed corpus here of Linear, where we've got photographs, we've got drawings, and attempts of a rendering of the signs on the documents written in Linear A. This is all great and good, but what more can be done with this is something that Esther will show us. And I think at this point I should probably hand over to Esther to take us into the world of digital wizardry.
Okay, thanks Torsten for this very rich presentation of Aegean scripts. And yeah, I would like to show you some of the things that we have been doing here in Cambridge to try and improve our understanding of Linear A and Linear B. And what I work on, as James said, is mostly Linear A at present. So what I've done in these past few years is the development of a digital database called Sigla for comparative paleographical analysis. So just bear in mind what a Linear A tablet looks like now in the printed corpus of inscription, the slide that basically you are seeing, that because I would like to show you the same document in the Sigla database. So that was Aegean 13. I'll try to share my screen to show you. Yeah. So can you see my screen now? Okay, so this is the homepage of Sigla, where you can do a number of different searches that can be general or more specific. So to the right, you have got the option of just browsing the whole corpus, where you can see all the tablets from Linear A grouped according to site, and the site is in an alphabetical order. You can also have a look at the sign list comprising all the Linear A signs so far attested. These are subdivided into simple signs that you can see here, and just by scrolling down you can see more complex signs that are called composite signs. These are typical of Linear A. Just a few of them have been carried on to Linear B, not all of them. And you can also see, for instance, the individual components that make up every single composite sign. And this is quite useful because not always is it easy to understand which individual signs make up a composite sign. If you go back to home, just if you want to do some general searches, another option is to, for instance, look at the map. And again, in the map, you can see the most important sites that have yielded the Linear A evidence. And just by clicking on one of the sites, you can see, for instance, the documents that contained. But now I would like to show you some of the most specific queries that we can do, that can be done under search, under sign, document, or sequence. So let us start, for instance, with Aegean 13. So Aegean 13 is a document, so I should look for it under document. We've got to Aegean, for instance. I know that it is a tablet here, and I search the corpus. Sorry, it's taking some time. Search the corpus. Okay, there we go. So here, for instance, I filtered that I want to see all the tablets from Agia Triada, and these are in numerical order. So Agia Triada 13, if we scroll down, we find it here. Of course, there is also another option, a shortcut to look for this document, that is by using the lens here and just writing Agia Triada 13. But sorry, 13. But I wanted to show you the slightly longest basically procedure in order to look for a document so that you can filter your own and customize your own searches. So what is new in Sigla and could not be done with a printed corpus is that basically if you hover with the mouse over the signs, you can see both the function of a sign and also the possible phonetic reading. So for instance, this one, sign number 11 on the tablet, is a syllabogram, which means is a phonetic sign. And given that the same shape also appears on in linea B, we can potentially try and read it with an approximation with the value 2, that is phonetic value listed at the top. What Sigla can also do is that if we click on 2, we are redirected to the paleographical charts showing all the different attestation of this sign across different sites. And this is super useful in order to carry out meaningful statistical and comparative paleographic analysis. If we go now back to Agia Triada 13, I would like to show you another function. So this is a sign view, which basically means you can see the functions of the different signs, syllabograms, logograms, transaction signs, or fractional signs. You can also switch to word view when you can see the words that are attested on the tablet. And in this way, basically, you can see clearly when a word starts and when a word ends. We can also do more. For instance, we can look at all the occurrences of a given word in context. Like here we've got kuro, which potentially allegedly means total. And here we can see where kuro, this word, occurs all over the documents. And you can see actually that there is some kind of contextual frequency. Kuro is always attested at the end of a document. And this is one of the reasons why it has been argued and suggested that kuro may mean total in most contexts, although not in all of them. So this is basically what we can do with Sigla in terms of paleographical variation, but we can also look for traits that are more associated with the tablet making process and tablet and the epigraphical features, basically. To do so, I would like to show you how to look for erasures. So what is an erasure? An erasure is a context where a scribe has cancelled purposely a previously written sign and has written something else on top. And this has got to do with the tablet making process and the editing of the documents. So if we do that, we need to add a criterion for selection. I want to look for a sign that is an erasure, and I want to look for it on real documents. I search the corpus. And if we allow a bit of time, there we go. So the red highlight basically shows you where the scribe has cancelled purposely something that was written before the real inscription that you can say on top. You can notice that a good number of Linea A tablets show this kind of feature. And in fact, most, if not all the Linea A tablets are palimpsest, which means that they were written, erased, and written, and another inscription was written on top. At times, it is also possible to see the first sign that was written by the scribe after, before being cancelled. And here, for instance, this is the red one, and is the sign AB08, also read with the phonetic value A. So I think I may want to just stop here with this kind of little Sigla show off. I showed you the most functionality, the most important functions that you can work on with the Sigla, and is a bit also of a didactic tool where you can explore the Linea A corpus and do a bit of your own, basically your own searches. I would now like to move on to Calibra. Calibra is not something that I have been doing myself, but is something that has been developed within the university. Sorry, I'm just trying to, oh, there we go. So Calibra at the moment hosts the linear bit tablets from Pilus in the form of photographs. I would like to give you an example here. This is Pilus tablet TA713. It's loading. Yeah, here we go. So these is palm leaf shaped tablets, and you can see that the inscription is much neater if compared to the linear A tablets, and disposed on three different registers. So what we are planning on doing with Calibra is to expand the current data set by adding pictures from linear B tablets from other sites, and especially we would like them to be added in the form of RTI images. So RTI images are called, this is the acronym for reflective transformation imaging, and this technique allows you to see a document under different light settings. So this is the RTI viewer, where by moving basically the source of the light, as you can see what I'm basically doing here, you can adjust the lighting setting and see more clearly some of the signs. So this will allow us to carry out more meaningful and precise readings of the signs. I can try also zoom a bit in order to give you a bit more of an idea of what this technology can do. So here you see, by turning the light source in different direction, you can actually see the signs in different see the different traits of each individual signs more or less marked. So I think this could be all from me at the moment, and I hope I gave you an overview of what we have currently been doing and what we plan on doing in the future. And if you like Sigla anyway, and if you want to learn a bit of linear A by yourself, I think this is the tool to look for. And yeah, I hand it over to Pippa and Torsten now.
Thank you, Esther. I think it's very clear from Torsten's presentation of the sorts of things we're working on, and from what Esther has just shown us of these incredibly exciting new developments, that Cambridge is a really exciting place to be working on these scripts at the moment. And it's a real privilege to have so many colleagues who are working on you know, different aspects of different writing systems belonging to this kind of writing system family, if that's a good term. I thought I would just say a few words on the kind of concept of decipherment, seeing as we're talking about deciphering writing systems here, and that's sort of how things were built. I think any of us would probably say that, you know, when we kind of talk to the public, when we give talks on this kind of material, one of the most common questions we tend to be asked is, so when is linear A going to be deciphered? Have you deciphered it yet? And we get that quite a lot. And I think there's a bit of a misconception surrounding the concept of decipherment, that it's an all or nothing scenario. And it's also worth saying that there are actually multiple ways in which decipherment can progress. So when you try to kind of judge the decipherability of a writing system, actually there are a lot of different factors to take into account. And it is very often the case that we know quite a lot about a writing system, but we don't know the underlying language. Or conversely, that we do know the underlying language, but there are still a lot of kind of mysteries, or a few mysteries left over. Linear B is a good example where we understand Mycenaean Greek written in Linear B very well. So we have extremely well-developed understanding, and yet there are a few signs where we still don't know the exact phonetic value that belongs to those signs. So, you know, it's not as if we always know everything about a writing system. When it comes to deciphering, I think the fame of the Rosetta Stone, which contributed in a very important way to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs, tends to make us think that you need a bilingual or trilingual inscription in order to decipher an ancient writing system. Actually, that's very much not the case, but there are a number of writing systems from the ancient world where bilingual inscriptions have played an important role. The Cypriot syllabic writing system, so the one that exists during the first millennium BC, the kind of last surviving member of the Aegean scripts, that was actually deciphered back in the 19th century, partly through a bilingual inscription, and that was actually on Torsten's slide, the Idalian bilingual, which is bilingual in Cypriot Greek in the syllabic script, and Phoenician, which has its own alphabet. Phoenician had been deciphered maybe a century before. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, there's this big drive to try and understand these writing systems of the ancient world. And that, of course, continued into the 20th century and beyond. And we've got a great legacy from that. Actually, the fact that the Cypriot syllabic writing system was already deciphered was one aid to the decipherment of Linear B. However, there are only a small number of obviously shared signs between the Cypriot syllabic script and Linear B, just because the shapes of them had changed very much over time. So it wasn't immediately obvious for a lot of them how one is related to another, but there's maybe 10 or 12 really simple shapes that have common shapes and common values in both the Cypriot syllabic script and Linear B. And that was an aid to decipherment, but it took people a while to realize exactly how that worked. And partly that's because in Linear B, we never had any bilinguals. Decipherment was achieved by completely different methods. So largely by paleographic analysis, that is, understanding the repertoire of signs and the degree of variability of any given sign. And then, most importantly, identifying patterns in the sign sequences that we have, which allowed an identification eventually of Linear B as being written in an early form of Greek. So there are some big names associated with the decipherment: Alice Kober, Emmett L. Bennett, most famously Michael Ventris, and of course John Chadwick, who worked alongside him. And Michael Ventris, when he announced the decipherment of Linear B in the early 50s, was making an announcement of something that was still in progress. Decipherments very often continue in progress for quite a long time. If you look at, so for instance, I have a colleague who works on Mayan, and he tells me that Mayan is currently about 69% deciphered. And it's one of these things where it's just an ongoing effort, and they sort of work one sign at a time to, try and achieve, hopefully one day, 100% decipherment. But it can be a long and ongoing process. And actually, I suppose the final thing I wanted to say is that there is a great deal that we can understand about a writing system without having identified that underlying language. And Linear A is a great example here, because although we don't understand the language, we can be pretty sure of the value of most of the, well, certainly a great number of the core signs that are used to spell out words. The ideograms, which represent whole words or commodities, are shared largely with Linear B, so we understand those too, and we understand from context what the documents are about. So there's a great deal that we can do with Linear A. We just haven't quite worked out the language yet. Well, I'll stop speaking there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pippa, and thank you, Torsten and Esther also. Attendants are being slightly shy in their question answering. That's why we've been letting the speaking go on a bit. But we have one question, which I can ask to each of the panelists in turn, which is, what is the most interesting bit of research in this field that you're anticipating in the near future? Pippa, perhaps you'd like to start off with What do you think is most?
That's a very nice sort of counterfactual question. Let me see. Now, I think there are a few things that we know are kind of happening in the field. So there have been some new discoveries. Torsten mentioned the site of Ius Vasilius near Sparta, where a lot of new Linear B inscriptions have been found. And I think we're all looking forward to just working on those a bit more. There have also been some new finds in Cyprus as well that are kind of due to be published in the near future. I think for me, the big thing is it would be good to just see more things coming out of the ground. And it's, I suppose, one of the biggest challenges, I think, for the still largely undeciphered members of the Aegean scripts family is that we just don't have as much evidence for those as we do for the others. But even if it's just, you know, well, one new inscription, two new inscriptions, sometimes that can actually make a huge difference. There has in fact been a really exciting new Linear A inscription discovered. And it's a long one, you know, it's I think the longest one that we have so far, and you know that is really good for the discipline. It just gives us more to work on because we're trying to spot patterns, to analyze variation in sign shapes. That work that we're doing just continues. So the more little bits of evidence we have, the better.
So our audience has lost their shyness now, so I'm actually not going to go around for everyone, but we have 6 questions to answer. Or no more, they're coming in thick and fast. So firstly, the use of Linear A on hairpins, what does that suggest anything about what's it used for? Torsten, would you like to say something about that?
That's a very hard question, right? I mean, it's quite clear that the nature of the document can, really can shape our expectation as to what we are likely to find in this question. Right? So the administrative documents are, to a large extent, lists. Right? There are also a number of documents in Linear A that are in a clear religious context, like the libation tables, right? And these may well be votives or invocations. Sort, okay, and then we've got the more personal objects, such as the hairpin, right, or indeed the gold ring, right. And I'm afraid we really are not sure what these are likely to say. There tend not to be any shared sign sequences across the types of documents in Linear A. They may contain personal names, right? Partly ownership marks. At least typologically, that would not be uncommon. But unfortunately, it's very hard to say. Sorry to disappoint him.
Thank you. Another question asks about the Sigla database and says, that looks an amazing tool. Is there a plan to do an equivalent interactive database for Linear B? Esther, do you have any plans for this?
Thanks, James, and thanks for the question for anybody who asked it. So in a way, so the short answer is yes, I've already started on it. And this new database is called the Liberty, which is the Linear B electronic resources, texts and images. The problem is, if I want to answer with a longer question, is that I have not been doing the drawings myself as for Sigla, but I based basically the database on the current publications, on basically on pictures taken from the publications and the printed corpus, because I had to ease basically the process to just cover a lot of documents very, very quickly to write a paper. So in the long term, if I manage to do the drawings and separate each individual sign onto a different layer, I can produce something similar to Sigla for Linear B, but that is a long-term project. Thanks.
It is also. I'm sorry. It is also, of course, the case that for Linear B in particular, there are other digitization projects going on, right? And one must be careful, right, with this. I mean, ideally, one could liaise and go into joint projects with people, but these things are not always easy.
And just there's a later question which says, are these databases available for everyone to access, and that they're open access?
Yes, they are. Yes.
Just to answer that quickly. So a question for Pippa now: how much overlap of signs is there between Cypro-Minoan and Cypro-syllabic?
Yep, I think probably there's a very considerable overlap. It seems very likely that most of the Cypriot syllabic signs do have precursors in Cypro-Minoan. It isn't always easy to identify them. Sometimes they've maintained the same shape, and sometimes the shape has changed quite radically. But it does seem quite likely that the majority of those signs have Cypro-Minoan predecessors. And there are just a few signs where we think that they're probably later inventions. So there's for instance, there's a series of X signs for Xa and Xe, which look like later inventions, but mostly they seem to have been carried over, which is why we think it might be partly a sort of orthographic reform rather than a reform of the whole system.
Thank you. We have another question. Does AI, artificial intelligence, have a place in deciphering? Any one-word answers from anyone?
Well, I can say briefly that I am exploring the use of digital approaches and also machine learning techniques, but not for deciphering in AI at the moment. I'm using those basically to try and find out groupings of tablets that might have been written by the same scribe. So yeah, in a way, machine learning and AI is being used in our field, but not for decipherment purposes at the moment. The Pippa may have something to add.
Thank you. And oh, so I'm going to move on because we have now so many questions. Sorry, just one actually for Torsten. This one, can you give an example of what a linear A inscription says in spite of not knowing the language?
Yeah, well, perhaps the most famous examples are the libation tables that I have already mentioned, right? They seem to contain a verb that means something like to dedicate or not. Right? We can also identify some names and make some educated guesses that there are names of gods or theonyms on these tablets, and they are clearly on these libation tables, right? And there are clearly also place names on them. Okay, so these really look like dedicatory inscriptions. Okay, one very exciting document that we couldn't show because it hasn't been published yet, and that was found only very recently, is an ivory ring, okay, it's commonly described as a scepter ring these days, right, from Knossos, bearing a linear A inscription. And that, again, seems to be another religious text. And on it you get text which is then interpuncted with logograms of animals, right, and certain numbers of animals, right, in a row. And it does seem to be either instructions for or descriptions of a religious ritual that involves a religious sacrifice. Now, when this document is published, that now will be one of the most, if indeed not the most interesting linear A document to look at, because it is also by a long way the longest one. Okay, and then clearly also the one that we can probably say the most about. Okay?
Thank you. Very exciting. A question for Pippa actually here. In your research, do you ever look at modern parallels where existing orthographic systems have been adapted or adopted for new languages?
A little bit. Yes, I think it is quite interesting to look at some modern developments in writing systems just to see. It's not that they necessarily give us direct evidence for the ancient world, but they do tell us a little bit about what is possible. So yes, to some extent we do. And I'm actually involved in a very interesting project at the moment where we have a visitor at the Cruise Project who is working on a kind of art project looking at how the Cypriot syllabic writing system might have developed to the modern day, which is quite nice and involves kind of looking at other modern parallels for how writing systems develop over the long term.
Thank you very much. A very quick question for Esther. How long did it take to create Sigla?
Long. Well, I think I started it a good 2 years ago. I mean, like the conceptual idea of the data database, and then of course this is a collaborative project with a computer science researcher. So basically, we used our combined areas of expertise to create something a bit new. But yeah, I would say it started a good 2 years ago, and is still under ongoing development. For now, it only contains the administrative documents and a few non-administrative ones, and in the long term, it will contain the whole Linear A Discover so far, we hope so.
Thank you. We're running out of time now, but if there's a question which all of you can actually pitch in, just someone asked what sort of simple general overview types of books can you recommend for introducing these ancient scripts or alphabets, or writing in general even? Any ideas? I would say that, you know, if you haven't read Chadwick's The Decipherment of Linear B, that is still a fantastic read. I mean, it really reads it like a detective story, and that's still, you know, holds its own very well.
Yes. Yeah, but also the book by Andrew Robinson, right, on writing, right, which I would thoroughly recommend. And apart from that, simply have a look at our website at the courses Speech and Writing for Part 1A, and indeed our Linear B course, E2, and the bibliography of the Linear B tablets. There is a lot of bibliography there that is easily accessible.
May I just add another couple of references. Also, the Oxford and the Cambridge companions to the Aegean Bronze Age offer quite a nice selection of chapters on Aegean scripts in general in context. So that's also another place to look for references.
You might also find some interesting information on the Cruise website, especially if you want to see Mycenaean scribes in Lego.
And Pippa in Lego.
Indeed. Pippa has joined the pantheon of having her own figure in Lego. So those of you who are Lego fans as well may already know this. I'm very sorry to all of those who didn't have their questions answered. I mean, very interesting questions, but unfortunately we needed a lot more time and we only have an hour. But I hope that all of those attending got some idea of you know, really what an exciting time this is, with new inscriptions coming up, new research coming up, new databases coming up. It's really looking very much forward to new developments. As Pippa said, decipherment is not a kind of, not always, or not often, a flash in the pan moment of epiphany where in the click of the fingers everything falls into place. It's much more normally something which takes place over years and decades even. So but we are really do feel that there's enough going on, I think, certainly in Linear A now, that we're actually kind of over the cusp. We're really new developments are adding to that. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Kind of trailer for the next webinar, which is in 2 weeks' time, when Mary Beard and Christopher Kelly will be talking not about anything in the Aegean or the Bronze Age, but the Roman Empire, so a few thousand years later. Thank you very much, all of those who came to join us, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you very much, our panelists.